Session Blood.
Alright, welcome back everyone to Session Blood episode 23. And yeah, we hope you enjoyed our first video podcast last week. We had a bit of fun doing that, I thought.
Yeah, it's nice to, have people, see what we're up to, kind of more expressive.
See what we're like in the flesh and blood, one could say. But
yeah.
Anyway, so last week we dealt with dealing with Dorinthea, and yeah, we've got something a little bit different for you this week. But before we jump into that, should we just run through our shoutouts, which we always love doing to people in the community?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
So the main shoutout I wanted to do this week was to Dice Jar Games, a local game store down in Dunedin. Now, they actually hosted a classic constructed winner case tournament over the weekend.
And it was a winner case of first edition
Arcane Rising, which is worth pretty decent amount. Yeah. So that's pretty cool. And
that's a great prize.
That's such a good prize. Like, damn, it was actually my birthday weekend. Otherwise, I would have been kind of keen to fly down and lose to Matt Rogers. And speaking of, big shout out to everyone down at Dice Jar Games who helped set that up.
Yeah.
And we want to give a shout out to the commentators as well. I know Nick Butcher and Jacob Pearson were doing a lot of the commentary throughout the day. And if you want to check that out, it's on the Dice Jar Games YouTube channel, and we'll include a link on the video description for this if you can find it.
And if you're listening to us from Spotify or in the audio file, and you do want to check out our video, go to Session Blood on YouTube as well. That's where our channel is, and that's where you can see us in flesh and blood on the Session Blood channel.
Yeah, you can see our pretty faces. What's not to like? And I mentioned Matt Rogers, which is a bit of a nice little segue into congratulations to Matt for taking out the tournament and proving once again why he's the best player in the game at the moment. So he's playing a Dash mid-range deck. I don't have the exact deck list, but I'm thinking it's probably kind of similar to what he played at Nationals. But
yeah, also a massive shout out to Jesse Watts, who was actually the only person who managed to take a game out of Matt. Which is a massive achievement, and he plays a lot of the streamed games. So if you want to see a wizard in action, and a really good wizard at that who made it very far into the tournament, I don't want to spoil too much, but he's been featured on the stream a lot, and there's a lot of games where you can check out his play.
Yeah, and I thought it was really cool to see a player. I don't so much want to say a new player, because he's probably been playing for a little bit, but a player I hadn't sort of seen pop up too much just do really well. To take a game off Matt in the Swiss is probably slight spoiler, but a pretty good achievement. And if you want to see, if you're a wizard player yourself and you want to see how players get it done and constructed, highly recommend checking that out.
Yeah, and it's something that last time we talked about dealing with Dorinthea, and I'm pretty sure there's a game Wizard versus Dorinthea there. There's some matchups versus things like Katsu, and so it's a pretty great stream if you're into playing Wizard, because Jesse was featured. I'm pretty sure it's 6 out of the 7 games on the stream, something like that. So definitely check it out.
And the final shout out I wanted to do was to Matthew Heffelfinger, who is doing something I thought was pretty cool. It's like a charity fundraising thing linked to Flesh and Blood. I think it's linked to like a case break style thing. So I believe he called it Pitch for Charity, which again, pretty cool name. And it's raising money for the Heart Foundation. So if you want to contribute to that, which I think is a really good cause, I'm sure if you search up his name on the Flesh and Blood fan page
on Facebook,
on Facebook, that should pop up, and there'll be a link through to that. So great to see Flesh and Blood having influence on the real world and helping out.
Yeah, and also, we've done a giveaway in our previous episode, and it's something we would love to continue doing. So if you would like to support our channel, we've created a Patreon account, so you can check it out on patreon.com/sessionblood. We'll have a link in the YouTube description as well, and it's we've always wanted to kind of create, whether it's prizes for tournaments or prizes for you viewers out there, spot prizes, giveaways, stuff like that. We would love to do that, and any support that you give us would definitely help with that.
Yeah, because it's one of the things that a few of our viewers, listeners, fans messaged in asking if we had an account, so we thought we'd get around to just setting one up. We know it's been a tough year, so we're not expecting people to shower us in money or anything. But it's one of those things that any funds we raise from the Patreon will just be put straight back into the channel, sort of, doing giveaways, maybe hosting a tournament one day would be pretty cool.
And that is one of my dreams, is to kind of use this platform to do something similar to Dice Jar Games, where we get some of the best players in the world and get them to verse each other and then stream the games so you viewers can watch them and learn and enjoy. I love watching games on the top level.
Yeah, we could throw a little bit of commentary in even.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the thing. We can host it, comment, do the commentating.
The Session Blood Invitational.
Ooh.
You like it?
I see it already.
Yeah. All right, and like we say, we're pretty new to the whole Patreon thing, so if you have any feedback or questions, feel free to send us an email or make a comment, and we'll do our best to address that.
Definitely.
Yeah, so we're kind of just learning our way through this as well, so we're very open to any feedback you have.
Yeah.
And I know you had a shout out on the investment side of things.
Yeah, so I mean, investment side of Flesh and Blood has been growing, and people are wanting more information about it. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Freya on Discord, and I think it's Ada in real life.
On Facebook, yeah.
On Facebook. So massive shout out to you for all your involvement in the investment side of Flesh and Blood. You can check a lot of what she's talking about on the Discord Wall Street.
Yeah, the Wall Street. She's regular on that channel.
Yeah, channel. And she's also recently made a website called Fab with Freya. That's FREYJA.com. And it's got some great articles about, how you can get started in investing in Flesh and Blood, and just tips, things to avoid, things to look out for, and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I've checked out a few of the articles myself, and I think there's some really good stuff on there, so we definitely recommend you check it out. All right, yeah, so now it's time to dive into the topic of today's episode, which is conquering Katsu.
Dealing with those pesky ninjas.
Yeah, so we wanted to follow up, because last time we had dealing with Dorinthea, and in some ways there are some similarities between, you were mentioning to me earlier, between Dorinthea and Katsu, mainly in relation to the power of their on-hit effects.
Yeah. So, whereas, Warrior has this quite a lasting impact on Dawnblade getting a counter, you have something that permanently stays in play, which is the weapon gets progressively more and more the stronger as it gains counters. Katsu, on the other hand, has more of a burst of damage type situation where if you let Katsu gain momentum, you can take a lot more damage than you should.
Yeah, and the reason we wanted to, we spent last episode, now this episode, dealing with Dorinthea. Well, that's a nice little, I use the name of the thing. But dealing with Dorinthea and Katsu is because we feel those are the ones we've seen the most comments about from just people online, on Facebook, on Discord. And we find that those are two heroes that maybe newer players might gravitate towards a bit more. Like, I know my first hero was Ninja, for example, because I feel like Dorinthea and Katsu, Warrior and Ninja, they're two heroes that you feel like you're in control and putting the opponent under pressure. So rather than, say, like Brute and Guardian, which might require a bit more setup, for Dorinthea, you're putting the pressure on with your Warrior's Valors and your attack reactions, and Ninja, you're always putting pressure on with your combos. And it's one of those matchups, those are the two classes that we feel some players, you go to your local armory, and, like, your first round matchup is Ninja, and you're like, oh no, not Katsu again. Like, so... I played a fair bit of Ninja myself, and Carol's played a ton of games against Ninja. We've tested that matchup a lot. So we just wanted to try give some of our advice, like, a few tips and tricks, similar to our last video with Warrior, about some things you can do to try and improve that matchup.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things, I feel like the difficulty is with... when you approach Warrior, it's obviously the attack reactions and playing around them. Whereas because Ninja goes wide, which means there's a lot of small attacks in a row, there's a lot of room for error where you can, overblock one attack, not block enough on another attack, and then just get blown out by, the various combo pieces and whatnot. So I guess should we just jump into it?
Yeah, should we just jump right into it?
Yeah, so, one of the things, obviously with Ninja is you have the combo mechanic, which is cards that work well together that give a lot of value in terms of chaining them one after another. Yeah,
cards that get stronger if you've played a certain card beforehand with combos. So a classic example would be Rising Knee Thrust. So the red copy is a 0 cost that deals 3 damage. If you've played League Tap as the last one on the chain link, instead it deals 5 damage with Go Again.
Yeah.
And like a 0 cost 5 damage Go Again, that's one of the most efficient attacks in the game.
Yeah, if that card was just there without combo, and if it was a generic, it would probably be in every single deck.
Yeah.
And then you have something like the Katsu ability, which just makes it so much smoother to assemble those combos, because Katsu lets you And I just want to kind of stress that it's on the first attack that hits. It's not explicitly stated on the Katsu hero, but basically the first attack action card that hits, you can discard a card with 0 cost and search your deck for something with combo and then banish it, and you can play it this turn, which just kind of ties in this whole combo theme so well together, because, then you're just like, oh, do I block it? Do they already have the combo piece in hand? If I don't block it, they can search it up, and it just makes it tricky.
Yeah, it leads to a lot of difficult decisions, because it almost feels when you're playing against it that like every attack potentially has an on-hit trigger. So, if a ninja player starts with something like a Scar for a Scar, so 0 damage, 0 cost, 4 damage with Go Again if you're on lower life. So that card by itself isn't super threatening, but then you feel, if I block with 1 card for 3, I take 1 damage, but then they trigger their Katsu ability, and then they fetch up a Rising Knee Thrust, like I mentioned earlier, and then you're like, oh no, because then they follow up with like a leg tap, and then they get the value out of the Rising Knee Thrust, and suddenly they've gone from potentially maybe an average turn to a really good turn.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
The Katsu effect is one of the things we want to address today.
And another thing that is very threatening, and in my opinion is the strongest ability in any legendary, is Mask of Momentum.
Yeah, I probably agree with that. It's really good.
Yeah, it constantly threatens that trigger, which is an extra card draw, which is extremely powerful in a class that has so many attacks that are very low resource intensive and have Go Again, so you can kind of keep on going, which kind of creates that momentum to spiral out and do a crazy amount of damage. So that's something that you really have to keep in mind while blocking as well, because it's the third attack or more that
triggers it. Yeah. So it has to trigger an attack action. So yeah, I suppose those two things, and just I suppose a brief summary of what we'll address, and then we'll go back and do it topic by topic. Yeah, so that the mask trigger is a big one. So we're also just going to run through attack reactions to watch out for, because there's some pretty good ones that Ninja plays, and the general combo lines, maybe
and how to deal with them,
and finally, we'll probably look at some weaknesses of Katsu, to show like what you can do to put them under pressure to make their turns a bit weaker.
Yeah.
But I think maybe a good starting point would potentially be that Mask of Momentum thing you mentioned, because that actually ties into the harmonized Kodachi as well quite nicely. Because like Carol mentioned, Mask of Momentum, it's really like the glue that ties the whole deck together in a way.
Yeah,
I feel, because the classic sort of sequence that you might have to deal with against Ninja is where they pitch a 0 cost blue card, they attack for 1 with Kodachi, and they attack for another 1 with Kodachi, and you're thinking you don't really want to block a hit for 1, and then the third attack comes through, and the third attack quite often might be something like, say, a red leg tap. So that's a 1 cost ninja card, deals 4 damage, and just has built-in Go Again. And so when you're in this position, this is like a classic situation where you don't want to get blown out. So
yeah. First of all, that is a situation where you don't want that attack to hit. There is, especially, with any class, there's a temptation of, whenever you draw a really good hand, is that I want to keep this hand. I want to, I'll just see whatever happens on their side of the table, and then when it's my turn, I have this really cool hand that I can do stuff with. When you play against Ninja, I mentioned against Warrior as well, you're often on the defensive side of things. So a lot of the time, they dictate the pace of the game, and you try and basically trim down the amount of times that they can get an advantage or value on their play. And the same applies to Ninja most of the time, I feel like, with the exception of Warrior, where I feel that when you're a Warrior player, you still dictate the pace of the game.
You can put the pressure on them.
Yeah, because of how the counter stays on Dawnblade, it's a lot harder for Ninja to raise that. But yeah, basically, a lot of the things overlap, as I said before. So the first kind of mentality is, when you approach playing against Ninja, is trimming down the cards that don't block too well and paying attention to what they can do. As Kieran mentioned, something like a attack of Kodachi into a red leg tap is quite a common sequence, and it's something that you need to address one of those attacks. And most likely you probably won't block the Kodachis. Sometimes it's worth blocking the second Kodachi, because that kind of denies the ninja player the ability to draw from mask.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. That's one strategy that you can sometimes deal with it. Like we mentioned, you often don't want to block that Kodachi with like a full card from your hand, because that leaves you a bit more vulnerable if they've got like a really good hand to follow up those. But like Carol mentioned, if you do have a really good hand and that you feel you can take a bit of damage to put pressure on them, but you don't want to get blown out, one option is sometimes is to block the second Kodachi hit with a 1 armor equipment. So if you're a warrior player, for example, refraction bolters, which has that added benefit that then you get value out of it when you use it. If you're playing a ninja mirror, it might be breaking scales. It might be an Arcanite skull cap. There's basically a lot of classes that have an equipment that block for 1.
Yeah, and equipment is really important against ninja. I mean, obviously, if you're playing something like Kano, you might not have that luxury, but even an iron rot gauntlet, or probably not legs and ninja. I mean, and Kano, but just having 1 block can make a difference, make a huge difference in the game, because that can shut down 1 crucial turn. And sometimes, and even in Classic Constructed, sometimes all a ninja needs is that 1 big turn or 2 big turns where they kind of chain their attacks so well that it creates so much pressure that they maintain, being ahead in the game from that point onwards. So, and kind of going back to the classic Kodachi leg tap play, one of the things I want to talk about is knowing all their potential attack reactions. So luckily, Ninja doesn't have as many options as Warrior, but it still has some powerful ones, which is the main kind of one is Ancestral Empowerment. So Ancestral Empowerment is a 0 cost that pumps the ninja attack by 1, and you draw a card as well. Yeah,
so the draw a card effect on that is really what makes that card so good. So one issue is that with attacks of 4, that's usually like a classic attack that you want to play something like a red sink blow on, a 0 cost defense reaction that blocks for 4, or a springboard somersault from Arsenal, another 0 cost that blocks for 4. Or even your classic block with 1 card from your hand and like a 1 block equipment. Now, you can get away with this sometimes against Ninja, and sometimes you just need to pick your spots, but you do need to be aware of the threats left in their deck. So, if it's sort of turn 4 or 5 of the game, and you haven't seen them pitch an Ancestral, you haven't seen them play an Ancestral or block with it or anything, you need to be aware that by doing that, by blocking for 4 if you don't have a backup, you are now, if you do that on the league tap, you've used up a card, you've used up an equipment, or you've used defense reaction. They're going to play, they've got the option to play that Ancestral Empowerment. They draw a card from the Ancestral, so it replaces itself, and then they're going to draw a card from the Mask of Momentum trigger. So that's definitely something you need to bear in mind. In saying that, like, you can't constantly play scared around that the entire time.
Yeah, I mean, dropping 2 cards to overblock constantly, kind of, in the end, it will give them a bit of an advantage as well. So,
but particularly, I think on like a hand where you don't have the best hand, you've got like a decent hand, but not like the best hand ever. It's not the worst thing to then double block that leg tap. With 2 cards, because I mean you can still be open to other attack reactions and all that, but at least you've prevented like giving them this value. It's like, it's really bad if you block it for exactly 4, and then because that 1 damage is like not just 1 damage, that's 1 damage plus a Katsu trigger, which is going to continue on their turn and make it even more difficult to block.
Yeah, it's a Katsu trigger, it's a mask trigger. It basically means that they get a lot of the time, a free rising knee thrust out of that. So that's an extra 5 damage. And then, if they already had a rising knee thrust, it could be one of the other ones like Hurricane Technique.
Yeah, things like that. So that's, again, Ancestral Empowerment can be quite a difficult one to play around. And sometimes you just have to sort of suck it up and be like, well, I'm going to take that damage. But ideally, you want to put yourself in a position that when they're using those Ancestral Empowerments, they're just getting the Katsu trigger out of it. So you don't want to be giving them too much value. So if you give them a Mask of Momentum and a Katsu trigger off that's what starts to lead to like really difficult turns. Whereas, if you can force it out a little bit earlier. So say in a different sequence, if they just open up with league tap and you decide you want to block with a sink below, in that situation, they play the Ancestral Empowerment. It's a bit annoying because the Ancestral replaces itself. They're going to Katsu and pick up another card, but they've still...
It's not the end of the world.
It's not the end of the world. Like, then it basically is just 1 damage.
Yeah.
So that's...
Yeah, and talking about, attack reactions, the other 2 that I want to mention is one is Razor Reflex, which is also quite common in Warrior, but Razor Reflex plays also a different role in Ninja, in where it gives that go again that it gives to an attack, that attack action card that costs one or less is actually really crucial, because sometimes you can there are some pocket plays that Ninja players have that are, once you kind of know what they're trying to do, they're a lot easier to dodge. For example, you see a Ninja player with 4 cards in hand, no arsenal, they start off by not even pitching anything, just going straight for Snatch, for example. Which is an attack for 4, the red one. If it hits, you draw a card. So in a normal situation, this just screams Razor Reflex to me.
Absolutely.
Because that would end their turn, and they have 3 cards left in their hand, which means that there's so much value lost in that they can't that can't be their turn. They would do something else, like even pitching for Kodachi or something like that. So you can see that also with Enlightened Strikes, just starting a turn with an Enlightened Strike. Try and keep in mind, what if they have a Razor Reflex? So
and often, I think it's kind of particularly important. Like sometimes they might even go, say, pitch a blue card, attack with 2 Kodachis, and play the Snatch, and they've got like 2 cards left in hand. And like generally speaking, as a Ninja player, there's probably stuff you can do with those other cards. So like Harold mentioned there, they're trying to set up the Razor, and in those situations, you like really want to make sure that you've got some sort of backup. So if you've got like a defense reaction in that situation, and the Snatch is coming in for 7, a really good play here is you block with 1 card in your hand for 3, and so. And again, like we mentioned in last week's video, be very careful with your sequencing. So you block with your 1 card for 3, and that's your initial block, and then you pass priority to them for attack reactions. Now you don't want to use up if your 4 defense reaction right off the bat, because the thing is, yes, if that Snatch hits, they draw a card from Mask and they draw a card from Snatch, but their turn's over because they've used up their action point. If they want to use something like their Snapdragon Scalers here, so that's the legs equipment that you can destroy to give an attack with 1 or lower cost go again. If they decide to use that, that's when you can use your Sink Below or your Springboard Summon Assault or something along those lines. And it works really well because the math lines up with Razor Reflex as well. So if they then play the Razor, they go up to 7, and then that's when you flip over your Sink Below and go up to 7 or your Springboard. So that's like, I feel kind of a classic play you see pop up quite often, and particularly because Snapdragon Scalers is so important to Ninja. If you can draw that out, particularly like in the early to mid game, you're very happy with that. So
yeah, exactly, and it's one of these things that it's just so tempting. You see a Snatch come out at you for 4 damage to just use that 4 defense react to completely stop it. But yeah, just be mindful of Razor Reflex. And what Razor Reflex also does in Ninja is it can shortcut combo lines, which is a really massive thing to keep in mind, is that a lot of kind of combo lines have 3 to 4 pieces in them, I think. With something, we talked about the leg tap into Rising Knee Thrust, into one of their finishes. If there is a chance that your opponent could be trying to shortcut that, they might not have the leg tap, but they have that Rising Knee, and they have a 0 cost to discard to Katsu. So a play that they could do is go pitch a blue, Kodachi into a red Rising Knee. And if you don't play around the Razor Reflex, you can get blown out by something like, you block it for 3 with a card from hand, they Razor, they get to draw a card, they get to Katsu, and then they can finish it off with one of the powerful, some of the more powerful finishes.
Something like a Blackout Kick, for example, is a 1 cost ninja attack for 4 damage. If it has combo, it gets +3. So yeah, like Carol mentioned, if you get hit by the Razor, like you might be wanting to save cards for your big turn. So they go Kodachi, red Rising Knee, and you're thinking, well, if they want to, it doesn't have go again. Like I'm okay if they use both their equipment to give it +1 and go again, like Snapdragon plus Breaking Scales. But yeah, just bear in mind that if you block that for 3 there is a chance that first you take 3 damage from the Razor, they use Katsu ability, they search up a Blackout Kick, and they play that for 7. And now you're like, I was kind of happy to take 3 damage maybe, but like I'm not really happy taking 7 damage.
Absolutely.
So just, again, a lot of these situations we're going to cover, there's not really a very easy answer, but there's kind of like small things you can do to put yourself in like a better position.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like the more you keep that in mind, the more you keep track of, ancestral empowerment, these razor reflexes, because over the course of the game, your opponent will either be pitching them, using them, blocking with them. So the more the game drags out, the more information you have, and the more you can kind of adjust your play accordingly. The third kind of less used attack reaction is Lunging Press,
one of our favorites.
Yeah, which is a card that we really enjoy. I mean, I'm always been a big fan of the card. I mean, I used to run it in my Guardian list to take people out by surprise. But it's a card that it's a great fit in Ninja because it lets them, do that blue pitch. It's easy to discard to Katsu, and can sometimes getting that 1 damage through is all you need. Sometimes you can see something like Elect Tap for 4, and they block it for 3, and then
so Lunging Press attack reaction 0 cost that gives +1 to any attack.
Yeah. So it's fills the similar role that Ancestral Empowerment does. It just doesn't replace itself.
Yeah, so that one I think is it depends. Like I feel it's slightly less common because like whereas every Ninja deck aggressive one will run 3 Ancestral Empowerments, you might have some builds that run Lunging Press and some builds that don't. But it is just like another thing that if you see an opponent, say, pitch one during the game, and then later on in the game, all 3 of the Ancestrals are gone, their 3 Razor Reflexes are gone, it might be a situation where your opponent's attacking in for 4 with like a leg tap or something, or a snatch, and if you've got like a big block equipment up that can block for 2, you might just think to yourself, well, maybe I can block with the equipment plus the card from hand to block up 5. Like if I'm ahead in this game, and like if this is the window for my opponent to get back into it, then I'm just going to close that window right now. And again, Lunging Press, it isn't the critical thing about Ancestral is it does draw that card, whereas Lunging Press does not. It doesn't replace itself. So it's kind of less scary in a way unless it's getting them something like a Mask of Momentum trigger. But it is just another smaller thing to keep in mind, I reckon, for sure.
And the fourth one that I want to talk about that isn't really an attack reaction, but it's very popular is Art of War.
Yeah, that's actually...
because a lot of the time when you're versing a ninja, Art of War kind of takes place of that attack reaction slot. So I feel that good ninja players use it, they use their tunic, pop out an Art of War from Arsenal, pump everything, and use the banish ability. But great ninja players use it as an attack reaction. So like once they're attacking, that getting that +1 without your opponent, playing around it is just another way to get that Katsu and get that advantage.
Yeah, because Art of War, it's the one cost instant that it's got those 3 modes. So like Carol mentioned, in Ninja, you're generally only using the banish and attack action to draw 2 cards and either give +1 to your future attacks or go again. So it's got 4 modes, so you might use 3 modes. But yeah, so that's just like another card that can occasionally lead to like blowouts in a way. Because if your opponent has 1 resource up, or they can pitch to it, again, it's one of those things that suddenly, whereas you were looking fine and you were going to like block out all their attacks, if they give +1 at instant speed, banish a card, draw 2 more, then not only are you facing now a Mask of Momentum trigger potentially, you're also facing down a Katsu trigger, and their attacks for the rest of the turn, including the combo attack they're going to search up, is going to get stronger.
Yeah,
I mean, Art of War, it can be a difficult one to play around. I find sometimes, because again, giving +1, things like Ancestral Empowerment and Art of War, the fact that it gives +1 really makes it difficult for you to get value out of your defense reactions on. So if you block up for 4 and they give +1 on Art of War, if you have to use it to stop multiple triggers, you can use something like a Sink Below or a Springboard Somersault. But again, you're blocking 1 damage with a 4 defense reaction.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of the time it does pay off to slightly overblock Ninja, I'd say. Obviously, when something is like a red head jab is coming at you, it can be okay to just block it for 3, I guess. But yeah, it's just... I think knowing all these options that a Ninja player might have, I think is just makes it that little bit easier to play around, because any of those 4 kind of pumps that we talked about, if you have no idea what they are, a lot of it's quite easy for the ninja player to just blow you out with them.
Yeah, and sometimes you can look for, like, there might be small signals sometimes that they're trying to set one up. For example, if they've had a card down an arsenal for like 2 or 3 turns and they haven't used it on one of their attacks because you've been double blocking or over blocking, then you might start to think that could be like an ancestral empowerment. Ones like Razor Reflex, for example, paying attention to resources is really important here. So if your opponent sort of pitches a blue card, attacks with 1 Kodachi, and then attacks with like a leg tap or something, that might give you a bit of a hint. Again, it's difficult because there could be a few things they're doing, but it might give you a bit of a hint that they need that extra resource. That they're playing leg tap, they've got 1 resource up. If they've got 2 cards in hand, you might be thinking, well, they could have attacked for a second time with Kodachi and threatened the Master Trigger. So why are they not attacking with that Kodachi here? So again, one example here is because they might need that 3rd resource to play the Razor Reflex to pump up their leg tap, and then they discard the last card from their hand to search up the Rising Knee Thrust. Again, like I say, it's not a hard and fast rule, but these are sometimes small things you can keep an eye on for.
Yeah, exactly. And when playing against, now that we're kind of familiar with these tools that Ninja has, especially in the kind of attack reaction, defense reaction stage, it's good to have a look at. Maybe we can start going over the combo lines.
Yeah, the combo lines would be a good one because I suppose we've mentioned a few of them without really going through them.
Yeah, and kind of like how to approach it, because now Ninja has quite a lot of options when it comes to combo lines. I mean, I think the most classic one, and I think the one we should probably start with, is the Surging Strike line.
Yep, so Surging Strike, the combo lines, it starts with Surging Strike, which is a 2-power attack with Go Again. You'll generally see the red ones, maybe the yellows. The yellow one hits for 4, the red one hits for 5. That's followed up by Whelming Gust Wave, which is a 0-cost attack action. They hit for 1, 2, and 3, the blue through red versions, and they get +1 if you have combo. And those ones are strong because the on-hit effect is if it deals damage, you get to draw a card, and they'll Go Again. So obviously, if they Surging Strike and then Whelming Gust Wave before, it presents a bit of a dilemma for you to block. The follow-up to that is Magenchi's Release. So Magenchi's Release is a 1-cost injure attack, hits for 4 damage, or 5 with Go Again if you've got the combo. And that lets you search up Lord of Wind, which Lord of Wind, so that's a 0-cost blue card. And basically Lord of Wind, the additional text on that is if you have combo, when you play it, you can pay X amount of resources and lets you shuffle basically all the combo pieces back into your deck from that line. So by that I mean, say you Magenchi's Release, it lets you search up, if it hits, you can search up any number of Lord of Winds from your deck. So that's the strength of Magenchi's Release. So basically, if your Magenchi's hits, you can search up 3 Lord of Winds from your deck. And if you've got, say, like 6 Surging Strikes, Whelming Gust Waves, Magenchi's, any combination of that, you can then play your Lord of Wind for 2 damage, then pitch an additional 6 resources to give it +6, and then shuffle up to 6 of those pieces back into your deck.
Yeah, which is, I mean, if you get hit by all of them, the chances of you winning the game are not very high.
Yeah.
It's each one of those things threatens something, The on-hit of Surging Strike is threatening Katsu, which means kind of makes it easier for the ninja player to complete the line, the puzzle, the whole combo. You have Gust Wave, which is really powerful on-hit effect of drawing a card. And then you have, the ability to, on hit of the Magenchi's Release, that lets you search for 3 blue cards, which is, another card advantage thing. And then Lord of the Wind presents a large amount of damage. So how do you block that correctly? How do you tackle that? And I think just to something to keep in mind in general when playing against the Surging Strike line is how many of those actual pieces they have left and have in the graveyard, which is something to keep in mind.
That's a really important one because generally, like, the Magenchi's part of that combo generally is like the critical one that you need to block. But like Carol mentioned, for Lord of Wind, you can't actually pay those additional resources unless you have the targets in the graveyard. So when you're sort of thinking how many resources or equipments to commit to blocking the individual pieces, just like take a quick look through their graveyard. If they have like one Surging Strike and one Gust Wave in their graveyard, then that might not be like the scariest thing ever. And another really important thing is keep an eye on their Lord of Winds, because sometimes Ninja will be forced to block with Lord of Wind at some point in the game. Maybe they've pitched a Lord of Wind to actually give them the resources to start off this combo. So those are kind of the baseline things you want to pay attention to, because a Surging Strike full combo early on in the game, if they try to get that off turn 1 or turn 2, sure, it's okay for damage, but you don't need to fear the Lord of Wind that much. Now, as far as blocking it goes, that can sometimes be quite tricky, because I feel originally, like way back in the day, like the kind of common logic was that if you don't have a strong blocking hand, you can just take the Surging Strike, depending on how the game's going. But I feel like these days it's a little bit different. These days, sometimes they just have the full combo and there's nothing you can do. So like they've got a blue card in hand, they've got Surging Strike, Whelming Gust Wave, McGinstry's Release, and like maybe a backup. And in that situation, it's kind of just like, well, that was a bit unfortunate for me.
Yeah.
But I feel a lot of the time you actually do want to double block out that Surging Strike.
Just to stop one of the pieces from the Katsu trigger, basically they already need at least 2 of the pieces in their hand, right, to have something going. So that initial surging kind of completes the whole combo by getting that third piece, whether it's they might have the Magenshis, or they might have the Gust Wave and missing the other one, which kind of completes the 3. So yeah, I used to basically let it through, and then as soon as they use the Katsu trigger, then block up the Gust Wave and block up the Magenshis, which means that a lot of the time you end up with no hand, you just took 5 damage, and you stopped their attack. But
I feel like these days it depends on like the game state and the tempo of the game. Like if you are playing against Ninja and you're say like 10 or 12 life ahead, you might actually not be too worried about taking that Surging Strike. And again, a theme we'll keep coming back to when we talk about blocking these combo lines is paying attention to what's in their graveyard. Because I mean, if they've used up a red Gust Wave already, maybe on previous turn, maybe to block with, anything like that, sometimes you might be thinking like, my blocking hand's pretty decent. I'm actually fine with taking the 5 damage and then forcing them to use another Gust Wave and potentially Magenshis. And I don't mind. I can just take the 5 damage, block out those 2 critical threats they have in their deck. Their threat density has gotten lower, and you've kind of given yourself like blowout protection in a way, right? Because if you take the Surging, if they pitch a blue to play the Surging, they now have 2 cards left in hand, maybe 1 in Arsenal. So generally, the Gust Wave and the Magenshis is like, that's it. You just need to block those out. If the game's a bit closer, and you don't just want to take that 5 damage hit, then I think double blocking the Surging Strike is generally correct if you can block it out for 6 damage. Blocking it for 5 is quite risky sometimes. If you're trying to get away with blocking with an equipment plus a card from hand, or like a Sink Below plus an equipment, the issue with that play is, again, we mentioned Ancestral Empowerment earlier. If you block up with an equipment and a card from hand and Ancestral, that's a lot of value lost for you, because that equipment is like taken out of play for blocking for the rest of the turn. It's got a +1 counter for the rest of the game now, and they've still got the Katsu trigger, and that still replaces itself. So if you're going to block, unless you're pretty confident they don't have an Ancestral, then you probably want to block it for 6. And okay, so say you block that for 6, and then now they've got the red Whelming Gust Wave. At this point, they've played the Whelming Gust Wave, so at this point, if they pitch a blue card, assuming, we're going to assume they don't have Tunic counters, so they now have 1 resource left, they've got 1 card in hand, and they've got 1 card in Arsenal. This is where it can get tricky with things like Razor Reflex, because usually you're wanting to just like block that out for somewhere like 5, probably like 5 damage or so. But again, if they've got a lot of attack reactions left in the deck, it could be worthwhile blocking for at least 5. One thing is the breaking scales, which you want to keep in mind for the whole game. So breaking scales, the equipment, you can destroy that to give a combo card +1 attack. So if you're in a bit of a tough spot and you're going to get blown out by the breaking scales, then you need to account for that. That's why one option is you can sometimes just commit and just double block that Whelming Gust Wave as well. So you block it out for 6, and you do risk getting blown out here by Razor Reflex. So if they Razor Reflex, using their last resource, they're going to draw a card from the Gust Wave. They're going to be able to, search up McGinchys or whatever. But again, an important thing there is that, you know, if they don't have the McGinchys already in Arsenal, then it might not be sort of the worst thing, because if they've, you know, pitched their blue, played Surging Strike, 2 cards, they play Gust Wave, that's 3 cards, and now they've got 1 card left in hand. So if they raise the Reflex using their last resource, it puts the Gust Wave up to 7. They've got no resources, no cards in hand. So now if they draw 1 card from that Whelming Gust Wave hits, you've turned off their combo. Because even if they use Katsu ability to search up McGinchys, they have no resources to play it.
And that's something that I also wanted to add. One of my reads against Katsu has always been, when they do Surging Strike, did they attack with the Kodachi first or not? And I think it's one of something to keep in mind, because if they pitch a blue and attack with Kodachi and then attack with a red Surging Strike, and this is assuming they don't have anything on Tunic or don't have resources available, then that kind of gives you the information that they probably don't have any other pieces, because they probably, if they were actually going to go for it, they probably would have needed that resource from the pitch to Kodachi as well. So that's just like a little bits of information that you will start picking up the more you verse Katsu.
Yeah, so it's things like that, just figuring out, like, worst case scenario, like, what can my opponent do here?
Yeah.
So, yeah, like Aaron mentioned as well, you know, if they... you just want to see, like, what attack reactions they can play. If they get the trigger, can they still go through with their combo? So sometimes, generally, just, like, if you can double block the Surging Strike, you can double block the Gust Wave. You know, sometimes it still might be bad because they, you know, it's Ninja, they might flip over a red leg tap from Arsenal for 4 damage and keep going, or they might have, like, a Snatch or something. But at least you've kind of protected yourself here. And that's the thing. If you have something like a Sink Blow in Arsenal, again, that changes how you might want to block the turn. So in that situation, you might say, you know, double block the Surging Strike, and then they play the Whelming Gust Wave. In this situation, you just want to sort of look at where you are in the game, look at where they are. Like, are you on the defensive? Are you ahead? Is the game pretty even? Because sometimes if you can afford to make them burn things like a Breaking Scales, or, you know, burn through more combo pieces, it actually isn't the worst thing to take a little bit of extra damage. So, like, say, for example, they play the red Whelming Gust Wave, and you decide to Sink Below. So now you've blocked 2 cards on the Surging Strike, you've used your Arsenal for Sink Below, you've got 2 cards left in hand. If they then use the Breaking Scales, their Gust Wave triggers, they can use Katsu, discard a card, search up McGinchys Release. If they then play that McGinchys Release, and you just double block with your 2 cards in hand, that's actually kind of fine. You've taken 1 damage for this turn. They've used up a full red line. They've used up, you know, red Surging, a red Gust Wave, and a McGinchys. They've only got 3 of each of those in their deck. If you can take 1 damage and get rid of their Breaking Scales, I mean, even if you end up taking a little bit of extra damage from something else after the McGinchys, you know, they throw out 1 more attack, that's generally okay.
And I feel like, yeah, the Breaking Scales is something that constantly stays in play and constantly kind of threatens that one, you know, that +1 attack. So I feel like getting rid of it in a situation like that is actually quite beneficial for you, because you kind of have that peace of mind for the rest of the game that that's not a threat to you.
Yeah, so that's sometimes, like, you know, if you can almost, like, trick a Ninja into using the Breaking Scales, thinking that, you know, you might take 4 or 5 damage that turn and they get, like, a pretty decent turn. But if you're sitting fairly comfortable in the game, like, you know, if this happens when you're at 25-ish life, that's actually, over the course of the game, that's probably going to be a win for you. Because, like Carol mentioned, otherwise that threat looms over your head the entire game. So if you can get rid of that early, same kind of applies for Snapdragon Scalers we were talking about earlier. Sometimes, you know, if your opponent goes Kodachi, plays a Snatch with, like, no other cards in hand, you might be fine just blocking that for 3 and being like, I'm going to give, if you want to use your Snapdragon Scalers here, I'm going to give you that card from Snatch, and I'm going to give you the card from Mask of Momentum. I'll take 1 damage, and then I'll block out the rest of your attacks in my hand. And now I feel like I've won the turn. Like, you've got through, I don't know, 1 or 2 damage. I'm going to pass my turn, but now that Scalers is gone for the rest of the game.
Yeah. And so, yeah, so that's something how to address the surging line, Surging Strike line. I feel like, yeah, so just pay attention how many of those combo pieces they have in the graveyard, because that tells you if the Lord of the Wind is actually threatening or not. yeah, kind of have a look at their resources and things, because something like if they only have, say, 3 cards in hand and they go Pitcher Blue and Surging Strike, I feel like it's not that much of a threat, because that's already really. 2 cards gone. They might get the Gust Wave and then you can double block it. So even in a situation like that, it might actually be okay to even like single block that Surging or something like that. So
yeah, because the red line pieces are pretty precious to Ninja. So if they, like I mentioned, they got a 3-card hand and they pitch a blue and go Surging Strike. If you block for 3 there, take 2 damage. They use the Katsu. They're discarding a card from their hand, which can actually stack up over the course of the game. And then they get out their red Gust Wave, and you can just block that out with your hand. You're like, okay, sweet, I've taken 2 damage, and I've got rid of a red Surging Strike and a red Whelming Gust Wave. And it's those sort of things that you want to take like a bigger image of the game, rather than just this individual turn.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, Surging Strike is quite expensive for a Ninja to play. So, pitching a blue or pitching a yellow to play it is a pretty big cost, because a lot of this stuff is quite low cost. It's probably one of the kind of higher end cards to play, so it's a big commitment in terms of a play.
Yeah, and like just one other thing, this probably applies generally to the combo lines, but I feel it wouldn't hurt to mention it now, is that just pay attention to what your opponent's done last turn as well. Particularly like if you've been on the attack and your opponent takes like 7 or 8 damage, then when they like pitch a blue and play the Surging Strike, that's probably a pretty good indication
that they have something. One of the other pieces, at least,
that they've got like the Gust Wave or the McGinty's Release. So sometimes
that is actually a really good point. A big tell from a Ninja player is whether they decide to block or not.
Yeah.
If they're blocking, that means their hand is usually pretty average, and that their turn isn't that great anyway. If they're taking damage, which I feel like a lot of Ninjas are just happy to take a bunch of damage and just try and dish out more damage in return, that is an indication that they have something there.
Yeah, so you just want to pay attention to that, because particularly we mentioned attack reactions, that kind of ties back into it as well. If your Ninja opponent's taking 10 damage and then they pitch a blue and play a Surging Strike, like that is when you might want to be a bit wary of like, I'm probably going to have to playing around things like Razor Reflex and maybe Ancestral Empowerment this turn, because they're probably not taking 10 damage if they know that you can just go double block Surging, double block Gust Wave. Cool, now I'm 10 damage ahead. Like they probably have some sort of backup there.
Yeah. So moving on to other lines, I think the second most common one that we see is the leg tap line.
Yeah.
So I feel like the leg tap line is a little bit more cost efficient, but it doesn't have that kind of same blowout potential of Surging Strike. And I think the kind of central piece of that is the red leg tap, because it's just so frustrating to block. Red leg tap attacks for 4 for 1 cost, go again, which is just really well costed.
Yeah, it's like very, very efficient. Like you used to see Ninja decks that weren't even playing the leg tap line. They'd play 3 red leg taps just because it's so efficient.
Yeah, exactly. And and then, as we mentioned before, you have that Rising Knee Thrust, which is another extremely efficient combo piece if they, had played the leg tap beforehand.
Yep.
And then one of my favorite ones is Hurricane Technique, which is, Hurricane Technique attacks for 4. If you have combo attacks for 5, it's a 1-cost card that if you played Rising Knee Thrust before, and it gets that on-hit effect of if it hits, you get it back into your hand, which means they can do something like leg tap, Rising Knee into Hurricane Technique. If you can't block that Hurricane Technique, they get it back and they can just play it again for 4, which is extremely powerful. It's an extremely efficient line. With just 1 blue pitch, you can go leg tap, Rising Knee, do the Hurricane Technique, get it back and play it again.
And that's kind of the strength of the leg tap line, why it sees so much play, because you have access to either Hurricane Technique depending on the situation, or you have the Blackout Kick, which with combo it does 7 damage. So with Ninja, if you potentially with 2 resources, you can deal 4 damage on leg tap, 5 on Rising Knee, and 7 on Blackout Kick, which is 16 damage for 2 resources. So,
which is insane, and you can do that with 4 cards, one for the pitch, 3 for the combo pieces. So that amount of damage is just extremely cost efficient and extremely punishing, especially when you do it all in a row and then that, blackout kick also threatens a mask trigger or something like that.
Yes, so these ones, it's interesting because I feel it depends on the way they sequence their turn when they're playing things like league tap, because if they start with league tap and like you don't have a defense reaction that blocks for 4, it does present a difficult situation of whether you block with 2 cards or not. And again, like you always want to be paying attention to how many cards they have in hand. Mm-hmm. So, if they've got like a 3-card hand and they go pitch a blue card and play a league tap, that's when it might be worth like double blocking league tap for sure. Because you don't want to block with 1 card, you take 1 damage, they search up Rising Knee Thrust with their last card with the Katsu ability, and then they play the Rising Knee, and then you have to block with 2 more cards. You might as well just block with 2 cards to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of those things that the leg tap line, I mean, it's extremely efficient, but one of its weaknesses is that, they only have 3 red leg taps. A yellow leg tap is extremely easy to block, and a blue leg tap is not very efficient because it costs 1, so they can't really use it to pitch to Kodachis. So a lot of the time you won't see any blue leg taps. So they're really relying on that.
On the red leg taps.
Yeah. So that's something that once you deal with it, then you can feel safe that, the rest of those, they might have a blue Rising Knee Thrust, red Rising Knee Thrust, they'll all become substantially weaker.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where, again, equipment against Ninja is very important. Like, if you can hold on to it, you should. But at the same time, if there's turns where you feel like you just can't really deal with it, then don't be afraid to use the equipment. So, like, if they've got, like, a full hand, and they use something like Tunic even to open up with a league tap, so now they've got 3 cards left in hand plus Arsenal, then like that's a situation where you're probably happy just blocking with 1 card from hand plus an equipment for 4. The issue is here if you if you block this with 2 cards and you don't have a defense reaction Arsenal, then you're dealing with a 4-card Ninja hand with 2 cards left in hand, and that can just be really hard to deal with. They might then follow up with a Rising Knee Thrust of 5, and if you don't block that, then you're facing down a Hurricane Technique, or you're facing down a Blackout Kick, or they could just open up with League Tap, not looking to combo that out, and just play a whole bunch of other attacks after that. So, yeah, League Tap, I'd say it's probably one of the attacks that you don't, because they only have 3 of them, because it's so critical, you don't mind too much using a 1-block equipment and a card to block for 4 if need be. But like we mentioned when we're talking about Mask Momentum, you do need to be on the lookout for if they're going for that Kodachi League Tap turn. Because then you're really kind of playing with fire if you just decide to block that for 4. Because you're opening yourself up to any sort of attack reactions, and then you're going to have to block multiple cards to stop like the follow-up triggers anyway.
Exactly. And next up, I guess, is the head jab combo, which is not very widely used. Just purely because of how clunky open the center can be in Ninja. I feel like head jab by itself is a great attack. I mean, you have that classic 0 cost attacks for 3. A lot of the time kind of forces a block. And the end combo pieces of Pounding Gale and Fluster Fist are both quite efficient. Yeah, I mean, Fluster Fist sees a lot of play as this kind of finisher because you can fetch it as a combo piece that it finishes off an attack for 4. And Pounding Gale can do crazy stuff with things like Ancestral Empowerment or Raise the Reflex because it doubles up the amount of damage it does.
Yeah, but only with combo. So I think the important thing about head jab is that when you're facing down a head jab for 3, usually you can just block it, and then you just block it with 1 card, and then you deal with it if they've got Razor or Ancestral Empowerment. Because I think one thing to keep in mind is, like Carol mentioned, because Open the Center is so costly, they cost 2 resources, a lot of the time Ninja players that are playing head jab are running just the head jab itself. Like, they might have like a Fluster Fist or 2 in there to search up a Katsu, but you don't need to be like too worried about facing down and Open the Center. So when you're dealing with head jab, keep in mind that they can search up other combo pieces, which is something I think we'll get into maybe next. So that, they don't have to search up Open the Center, they could search up a Rising Knee Thrust instead. But if you're worried that, like, if I don't, if I get hit by this head jab and I can't block the Dominate, and that's going to like trigger their mask. A lot of the time, that's probably not going to happen. Like, I mean, there are some people who run it, and like maybe at your events there are people running like the full head jab open the center line. So just keep an eye out over the course of the game. But
just see if they actually have those cards, because if it's like turn
5
or 6 and you still haven't seen any open the centers, it could be an indication that they're not running it. I would be wary. I probably wouldn't overblock a head jab, but just to be safe, if they go Kodachi head jab after pitching a blue card, I probably would consider blocking that head jab, just because it stops that potential open the center mask trigger, or it stops them from getting a piece of combo for a different combo line.
Yeah, so that one I suppose it's relatively basic, and the thing is, if you see your opponent with like a red fluster fist or two, that doesn't necessarily indicate that they're also running open the center. A red fluster fist is quite strong because it's a 0 cost block for 3 card that deals 4 damage, and it has combo. That can come in handy for Ninja, because if you deal damage with Ninja and use the Katsu trigger, you might just be wanting to finish off your return with an attack for 4. So, say you've got a Ninja player, you've got a blue card in hand, you attack with something, attack with a Kodachi, you throw in an attack action, like a Scarf or a Scar, and you get the trigger off. You might just want to use the Katsu ability to discard your blue card in hand, 0 cost, fetch up Fluster Fist, and just throw down 4 more damage at the end of your turn, just to make your opponent deal with it and like stop your mask trigger. But I feel that kind of leads nicely to something else that I feel we should address, in that, blocking those initial opening attacks against Ninja, because I feel that's it's reasonably common when you're playing against a Ninja player that you'll see something, they'll open up with something like Scar for a Scar or Ravenous Rabble. So Ravenous Rabble is a 0 cost 5 damage card with Go Again, but you reveal the top card of your deck and it gets -X, where X is equal to the resource cost. So often you'll see these in like aggressive redline Ninja decks where they're playing that card because most of the time it's a 0 cost 4 damage Go Again. So these ones can be tricky sometimes, because often things like a Scar for a Scar or a Ravenous Rebel, you don't really want to burn your defense reaction on, because you feel like, it's not something obvious like it's going to trigger the Mask of Momentum, or, it's not like an obvious leg tap where they're definitely going to get the Rising Knee Thrust. But I think it is worth keeping in mind that this isn't just like a vanilla damage attack in Ninja. When they're using these cards, if you take 1 damage, you do let them potentially fetch up a combo piece. And again, just pay attention to the amount of cards in their hand, because if they Ravenous Rabble with 2 cards in hand, then you're not worried. Because if they trigger Katsu, like, what are they going to do? They fetch up a combo piece, they might get like a Fluster Fist, but like, if they start with a Ravenous Rabble and it hits with 2 cards in hand, they can't do anything. If they fetch up a Rising Knee Thrust, they can't pay for the leg tap and the Rising Knee Thrust. But if they open up with like a Rabble or a Scarf for 4, and they've got a full hand, that can sometimes be worth like using your defense reaction on. Something like a Sink Below, a Springboard Somersault, Flick Flag, whatever.
And it's also worthy to point out that their Ancestral Empowerment can only target Ninja cards. So if they do start with something like Scarf or a Scar Rebel, don't worry about getting blown out by Ancestral. You might get blown out by something else, but it won't be an Ancestral Empowerment.
And again, that's something to look for as well. Sometimes, conversely, I'm saying you have to be aware that you want to block these cards, but sometimes if you've either got a good hand or like a good attacking hand for your turn, or if you've got a good blocking hand for your turn, sometimes it's fine just to block these attacks for 3, because you get information. When we mentioned earlier for Katsu, it only triggers on the first attack action that hits in the turn. So, I found myself in the spot sometimes in Ninja where I've got something like, a Scar for a Scar in my arsenal, but the only 0 cost cards I've got in hand might be something like my blue card that I need for resources, and like a red, something like an Ancestral Empowerment.
That's really powerful, and you don't really want to discard.
Both of these cards are powerful. I need the resource card to actually activate my turn, and I don't want to discard the Ancestral because it's such a critical card in my deck, right? So if I open up with a Scar for Scar here, and you've got, say, 4 cards in hand and a defense reaction arsenal, sometimes you might just say, okay, I'll block for 3, and I'll see what you do. Because the thing is here, if they don't search, if you can sometimes force a good card out of their hands, or then it makes blocking for the rest of your turn a little bit easier. Because they do this and then they follow up, say, like a leg tap. If they follow up with this leg tap, you're thinking, well, they've probably got the Rising Knee Thrust. So, because like they haven't used their Katsu ability, you can either decide that like, one, I
I need those blocks for that Rising Knee thrust that will be coming down. And to stop the mask trigger, for example.
Yeah, so you might think, for example, like if they then throw down like a red leg tap, you might just block with one card because like you think, well, the Katsu trigger's turned off.
The actual leg tap doesn't really do anything because it's the second attack. It doesn't trigger mask. It doesn't really threaten anything because the Katsu's turned off already.
Yeah, so then this might be a situation where you've got a good hand. You take 1 damage from the Ravenous Rabble, then you take block with 1 card and take 1 damage from the leg tap, and then when they follow up with the Rising Knee, that's when you like, this is the card I have to block out.
Yeah, that's when you double block.
And then you can double block the Rising Knee thrust, and if you've got the defense reaction arsenal, it protects you from like the blowout potential of something like a Razor Reflex as well.
Mm-hmm.
So these ones, again, like there's not really any hard and fast rules. I think if you sometimes if you haven't been able to put pressure on the Katsu player and you feel like you need to use a turn to like catch up, I think playing a defense reaction on that first initial attack can be worthwhile. I think it's better than... I feel like you don't really want to use your equipment to block these Scar for a Scar or Rabble opener turns, because those are so critical to you for the rest of the game. But if you feel like, that Katsu player might be actually relying on this to set up their combo, then that might be a turn where you just drop the Sink Below on the Scar for a Scar, and then like kind of
at the end of the day, you're saving yourself some life.
Exactly, yeah. So you've saved yourself a little bit of damage, and then you've also like protected yourself a bit from, if they then follow up with like a yellow leg tap, you're probably thinking, well, I can block this now. And again, if they burn an attack reaction on something like a yellow leg tap in this situation, that's not the worst thing for you, because they've used the Rabble, they played leg tap, they've got 3 cards left in hand. If they have to pitch 1 card to play Razor Reflex, now they're down to 1 card in hand. So you take 3 damage from the Razor, they search up the Rising Knee, but then like, it's better to use, it's better to be hit by an Ancestral or Razor in a situation like that than it is on like the 3rd attack of a turn where it can pump up a mask or it can use a mask trigger, something like that.
Yeah, and with Crucible, we've seen the addition of some more combo lines, which are both kind of starters block for 3, but can only get go again if they hit. So those are kind of easier to deal with because... this gives Ninja some more tools to go more on the defensive. So they're not as threatening. They still, we have the Soul Bead Strike and Torrent of Tempo, and those have the condition that they must hit to get go again. So with these pieces, I feel like it's just makes it a little bit easier to block because... you can just feel safe while kind of over blocking them a little bit sometimes here and there, just to make sure, because it will shut down your opponent's turn. So it's a lot easier to read their hand, whether they have something like a Razor Reflex or an Ancestral Empowerment, because they have cards in hand. So I feel like those aren't too big of a concern.
Yeah, and again, like we mentioned with Head Jab, some Ninja players in super aggressive decks might be running 3 red Soul Bead Strikes and 3 red Torrent of Tempo, but they just have them in there for damage. So, some might run like 1 red copy of the follow-up, or just none at all. They might just have the blue versions. So these attacks are sometimes ones they just put into the deck because it allows them to pressure you. Yeah. So, they can go leg tap, attack with Kadachi, leg tap, you block up the leg tap, and then they play a Torrent of Tempo for 5, forcing out cards from your hand.
Yeah.
But these are ones that, if you're worried about the Katsu trigger more than the fact that it's going to get go again, sometimes you got to pay attention during the game, but sometimes you can afford to let those trigger if you're not too worried, if you're not going to be like, no, I've got to block like a Rushing River or something before.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, like, we're still not seeing too much use of that. I mean, in Blitz, we're seeing use of the Heron's Flight and a little bit of the Find the Center combo lines and Iris. But in Constructed, I feel like players are still finding how that fits in Ninja, and I feel like those are more kind of mid-range combos rather than your classic redline aggro Ninja combos. So I feel like those the tips that we kind of told before about blocking, those kind of apply to this as well. One of the things Heron's Flight makes things pretty much is extremely hard to block. So a lot of the time you won't be able to block that anyway. Find Center is a card, that it's quite important when you're running stuff like Ninja yourself or Runeblade.
Yeah.
But yeah, I basically wanted to kind of start talking about the weaknesses of Katsu and how you can really punish them for the weaknesses. And the main one is, unlike most other classes, ninjas combo starters, the ones in Welcome to Wraith, leg tap, surging strike, head jab, they all block for 2. So
it's a big one.
Yeah, a lot of these attack reactions, you have Razor Reflex as well, lunging press, and Out of War, they're not really good blocking cards. So Ninja has, especially, the aggressive Ninja lists have a real weakness of having low blocks, which you can definitely punish with things like, I quite like Command and Conquer, actually. Yep. It's a generic attack action card that, they kind of are forced to block if they have an arsenal.
And Command and Conquer is really good because against Ninja, the Arsenal card is like almost always going to be pretty critical to their turn. Mm-hmm. Like they might put something like a combo opener, something like Plunder Run, which we might address after, Razor Reflex and Ancestral. And it's the thing, like Carol mentioned, because they have cards that block for 2, it's not like super uncommon for them to maybe have 3 cards that block for 2 in hand. Mm-hmm. So if you play down something like a Command and Conquer against Ninja, it can really buy you a lot of time.
Yeah.
If they take 6 damage and destroys their arsenal, that's like really good for you. Yeah. And you're stoked.
So you deal a bunch of damage, you destroy a key piece of their their plan for the next turn. If you do force blocks, a lot of the time you're forcing multiple blocks or the equipment. And that's something I also wanted to address, is that they not only have weak defenses in terms of the cards in hand, but the equipment that Ninja has is quite weak as well. So a lot of the time, they have the Breaking Scales blocks for 1. They might run the Ninja Crucible boots.
Bree's right, but generally they're on Snapdragon anyway,
yes, which doesn't block. So, and they really don't want to block with their mask or tunic. So that's something to really abuse in that matchup. So try to think of cards in the class that you're playing with on-hit effects that they kind of would have to block. Mm-hmm. Ranger has a ton, for example. You have the Red and the Ledgers, the Remorseless. Those are kind of great cards. And Guardian, you have Spinal Crush, things like this. So try and utilize your own on-hit effects. Another thing is, not only do Katsu cards not really block very well, but they try not to block. Their hands with 4 cards in an arsenal are exponentially better than, say, 2 or 3 cards and no arsenal. So so basically you want to strip cards from their hand. You want to force them to block. If you're not forcing blocks, then trying to deal as much damage as possible. Because you're blocking a lot, most of the time that's going to be happening with 1, 2, or 3 cards. So try and look at your list and make sure that not only you have great blocks, but you have also cards that do. You have great turns with only 1 card in hand, even if it's like a weapon swing, or 2 cards, which is something like pitch, play a Command and Conquer, or pitch, attack with a red drone.
Yeah, and
or any kind of combination of. That you kind of put a lot of pressure with only 2 cards.
Yeah, because when you're playing against Ninja, it's definitely a huge trap to say, I'll just take I'm willing to take a bit of damage to get my really big turn off, because the deck snowballs so hard that sometimes you're like, I'll take this hit, then I'll take this hit, and then
next thing you know, you're kind of forced to block it because they drew a card from Mask, they're getting their combo and all the ducks in a row kind of thing, and then you're like, oh, was it really worth it?
Yeah, because you don't want to be in a spot against Ninja where you take sort of the first 5 or 6 damage, and then you find that you have to block with 3 cards anyway. Mm-hmm. Because Ninja, it's a deck that I feel like a lot of time in the game, there might only be 3 or so, 2 or 3 really big turns where it's critical that you block out, that you have to get everything right. Mm-hmm. If you survive those big turns, you can really make Ninja struggle. Mm-hmm. Ninja can be prone, because of the nature of combo, to occasionally having off turns.
Yeah, because sometimes the combos just don't align. And, or they draw 4 red cards, so they don't have a pitch card. So there's Ninja, just like we talked about with Warrior, will have those kind of off turns that you can kind of punish as well.
Exactly, and those are the turns, you don't want to be taking in, a whole bunch of damage to get, even an equal or lesser amount of damage back, because it lessens your flexibility for the rest of the game, mm-hmm. which is really important. Whereas if you're patient against Ninja and you block out the big attacks, it's a deck that is definitely prone to getting progressively worse as the game goes on.
Mm-hmm.
So things like we mentioned, like you have to discard cards to trigger Katsu, so pay attention to what they're discarding. Once they've used up their red line strong attacks, whether it be Surging Strike or Leg Tap, if you're playing against Ninja and they've got 3 red Leg Taps and 2 red Rising Knee Thrusts in the graveyard, then suddenly you're thinking like, the light is at the end of the tunnel. I don't have to survive too many more turns. Particularly important when you're dealing with things like Surging Strike Ninja decks as well. Because against these ones, similar thing. Like if they've only got 1 red Whelming Gustwave left in the deck, or 1 red or 1 Megenchi's released, then you want to make sure you're structuring your blocks not just to minimize damage, but to make sure you don't get hit by that final attack.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing worse than like blocking correctly most of the game, and then you're 8 life ahead, and they open up with a Surging Strike, and you double block with your cards. And then suddenly you've got 2 cards in hand, and they've got both the Gust Wave and the Megenchi's Release, and like a Razor or something like that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like you've just given them a huge window to get back into the game. So just really pay attention, because if you're just trading damage with Ninja, and it gets like halfway through the game, and you're both on like 20-ish life, and they've got like, you can see they've got so many of their good red line attacks in the graveyard, you're actually winning. Like it's not just a life total. Like you can't afford to fall like way too far behind, because then you risk getting like just chipped out at the end of the game with Kodachis. But I mean, sometimes it's fine to be a little bit behind on life if you're ahead on threat density in your deck.
Yeah, and it's something like, if they're running those Scars or Life for Lives, being behind actually sometimes stops them from being able to utilize those cards efficiently.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the thing. I think Ninja, really important to pay attention to what combo lines left in their deck. Because like I said, sometimes if they've got 1 red Whelming Gustwave left in their deck, and you've got a good blocking hand, if they Surging Strike, you might just want to take 2 damage there. Because if they search up their last Whelming Gustwave, and you're like, okay, I know I can block this, then that's fine. Like you've taken 2 damage, you block out their final Gustwave, and then you're like, now your Megenchi's combo line is gone, basically. Yeah. Like, I mean, you might have like a blue Gustwave left, but that's probably not going to threaten it. So
yeah, and that's another reason why kind of putting pressure with 1 or 2 cards, whether it's even, as a Guardian being left with 1 blue card and just going pitch and attack with Hammer, eventually that damage will stack up over the course of the game. I mean, if you... But it also forces blocks. So if they're forced to block with something like a Megenchi's, you're not only putting a little bit of pressure on their life total, but you're putting pressure on their threats left as well.
Because I think against Ninja, sometimes you might be playing these decks where you're not afraid to actually just throw out a big attack on turn 1. Like, you might not throw out a premier thing like a Command and Conquer, but just things like hitting for 6 with a weapon, or throwing out an attack for 7-ish with Guardian. Because in Ninja, like they might have a hand, for example, something like they got Lord of Wind, a Megenchi's release, and like a red Leg Tap in hand, plus any other card. So if you threaten 6 damage here, and they block with like any one of those 3 cards, plus the other card in hand, you're really happy. Like, again, with Ninja, it's not always about getting through damage, it's about getting through the threats in the deck. If you're forcing them to block with threats, that's great. Like, I mean, anytime you get something like, a red Combat Opener, or like a red Gustwave, a red Rising Knee Thrust, Megenchi's, any cards like that, Ancestral Empowerment, there's so many cards, critical cards that they rely on in the deck that don't have that sort of extra redundancy like Warrior. Like Warrior, if you force them to block with like a red Warrior's Valor, that's not the end of the world, because they're like, well, I've still got all the yellow ones and the blue ones. Whereas Ninja, because they run the deck so refined a lot of the time, if you force out like critical combo piece blocks, that's a huge win for you. So that's definitely one of the weaknesses, in that they have a lot of cards that they rely on to do things. And if you can disrupt that, if you can keep the pressure up on them, and just make sure that like when your hands that are like below average to even like reasonably good, it's worth blocking out those hands against their good hands, basically.
Yeah, and basically try and, just to kind of summarize it, I guess it's like familiarize yourself with the lines, especially if you're playing a local armory and you have Ninja players that kind of play certain types of Ninja. Just be aware of all the lines and the cost and stuff like that. I reckon that's really important. Also, be aware of the attack reactions and try to play around them. Run defense reactions, and before you verse a Ninja, kind of make sure that your list is streamlined, and so that it can block very well, but also put pressure, as I said, with 1 or 2 cards.
You don't want to be running like a bunch of potions and 2 blocks against Ninja, because it just makes life so much harder for you.
Yeah, lean on your equipment if you do have equipment, if you're playing something. And something that I haven't mentioned but want to add is, Redline Ninja is quite weak to arcane damage. Whether you're playing Runeblade or Wizard,
Yep.
chances are that they won't be blocking that damage. So that's something to keep in mind. I mean, they're going to be putting a lot of pressure on you, but mainly taking most of that arcane damage.
And also, they don't run that many defense reactions against Ninja. Like, that's something where, you know, if you're trying to set up something like a pummel, or like, you know, some sort of attack reaction onto one of your attacks, or you've got like a combat trick, I suppose, to use like magic terms. You can, or set up like a dominate attack on Guardian, anything like that. You can, like, some Ninja decks might run like, say, like 2 or 3 red Flick Flags, maybe a red Sync Blow or so, but it's not uncommon against certain builds to see them run like 0 defense reacts, or like
just go all in aggro.
or like 2 or 3. So a lot of the time you can take advantage of that and say like, I'm willing to take X amount of damage, pretty safe in the knowledge that they don't have the defense reaction to blow me out. You know, decks that have Dominate, like Warrior with Ironstone Determination, Bravo with a hero ability, that kind of thing.
And a great way for classes like, you know, Warrior, Guardian, Runeblade, is to really utilize that equipment on the big... If you have a, you know, if you want to take back the tempo, you can lean on that equipment, block up, you know, that second Kadachi or whatever, just take a little bit of damage, make sure to stop their kind of like big, powerful attacks, but then you can really put the pressure back with something like a Dominated Crippling or Spinal Crush, or, you know, like Determination play, as Kieran said, with Warrior. So, yeah, basically you want to kind of punish their bad blocks, block well, familiarize yourself with the lines, just block their lines correctly. It's fine to take a bit of damage here and there and kind of wait through when they have their on turns, because they will have those off turns, and that's when you can start pushing back.
Exactly. Like, you know, there'll be a time in the game against Ninja where their turn is just sort of pitch a blue card, Kadachi, and throw out like a random attack for 3 or 4 that you don't care about. And like, those are the turns you wait for. If you're patient against Ninja, you will get paid off eventually. Like, they might put you under pressure for 3 or 4 turns in a game. If you're neutralizing their damage while playing through their critical threats, that's when you like start to pull ahead. It's when you get blown out and take like 15, 20 damage and fall way behind. That's when you're in trouble, because then that allows them to play that game against you. Then the Ninja player can say, you know, I don't, like, when you have your big turn, I don't care what you do. I'll take 15 damage if you want to throw out 15 damage, because my turn's going to be better than yours.
Exactly.
I guess the final thing I just wanted to address briefly, I meant to bring up earlier, was Plunder Run turns, blocking Plunder Run. Plunder Run's a card, so it's 0 cost action. When it's played from Arsenal, it gives your next attack +3, and when the next attack action card during the turn hits, you get to draw a card. Just really keep that in mind, that it applies to all attacks in the turn, not just the first one. I've been caught up by that before as well. So, you know, if they play a Plunder Run and then like a Scarf or a Scar and you block it for 7, and then you're like, okay, I'm in the clear, and then they throw out an attack for 4 and you block it for 3, they'll draw the card from Plunder Run.
Yeah. And also, I mean... you know, good Ninja players play the Plunder Run before attacking with Kadachis, because Kadachis break the chain. That's something to keep in mind. If you see a player go, you know, I mean, the Plunder Run breaks the chain of Kadachis. If you see someone go Kadachi, then play Plunder Run and attack, that attack will not draw them a mask card. Won't trigger Mask of Momentum.
Exactly, yeah. So if they go Kadachi, if they go Plunder Run, Kadachi, then an attack action, like, that is like an absolutely critical card that you have to block. Like, if there's any way you can block it, just make sure you can, because if you don't, they're drawing 2 cards. And often if they're setting it up like that, they might be doing it because they've got either the next combo piece or they've got like the attack reaction. So just try and, like, again, Plunder Runs are the turns that sometimes it's unavoidable that you're going to take a bunch of damage. If you don't, those are key turns to use your equipments on and use your defense reactions if you have them. So, like, the thing with Plunder Run is, sometimes you just have to like look at your hand and assess like, what can I actually do to stop this? I think, you know, if they go something like Plunder Run, Surging Strike for like 8 damage, just bear in mind that like sometimes you might just have to like eat some of that damage. You know, like you might just have to take all 8 and then deal with the rest of their turn. Again, it's difficult to deal with, but you know, you just want to make sure that you don't leave yourself completely wide open. So if they do that big Plunder Run thing, you block with like 3 cards, and then they throw in like a Whelming Gust Wave that you can't block, and then you're fully open to them against your line. Like Plunder Run in general is just like, it's difficult. Like, I'm trying to think of like some good general advice. I guess my main advice would be that if you can block the first Plunder Run attack with 2 cards to block it out, then yes, try to do so. Like if they go Plunder Run, Scarf or a Scarf for 7, and you can block for 7, then you might as well, because you never know, like, that might be the attack they're relying on to get through damage. So don't just, like, let them get away with it for free. But again, if you feel, like, if you kind of sense something's coming up, or if you feel that, like, that you don't have the potential blocks to block the follow-up attacks from that, then sometimes it's worth just considering, like, I'll just take all the damage. And, like, particularly on that Surging Strike example or Leg Tap example, sometimes, like, depending on the life total, if they Leg Tap you for 7, like, really just think about if it's even worth blocking for 3. Because if you block for 3 there, what are you really achieving? Like, you're saving yourself 3 life, but you're not...
You haven't stopped their triggers, and you're reducing the amount of blocks for further attacks.
For the critical turn. So, like, I mean, if you can afford to, it might just be worth taking the 7 damage and saying, like, I'll block all your other attacks. Like, again, usually you do want to block the first Plunder Run attack. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, it's not just being like, okay, I'll take the damage and it's fine. But if there are situations where, like, the life total, you're, like, reasonably far enough ahead, or you've got, like, a decent life lead, you feel that, like, you need to block up the follow attacks, just consider if it's worth throwing away a card when you're not going to stop their triggers anyway. Because, like, the worst, you don't want to, like, block with one card and then find yourself one card short to block, like, everything else at the end.
Yeah, and if you do all of the stuff we talked about, you're going to smash ninjas.
Yeah,
it's
like...
easy, right?
I mean, a common thing we've seen, actually, at a lot of tournaments is ninjas, like, there'll be a lot of ninja decks that do quite well in the Swiss, but, like, sometimes fall just short of top 8, or lose in the first round of top 8. Which isn't, definitely an interesting thing. And because the thing is, once you learn how to block ninja really well, you can, like, massively improve your matchup with it. It really, like, rewards time and effort into, like, playing against ninja and blocking it. So... yeah, like, it might seem like this unbeatable deck sometimes, but honestly, it's really not. You can get there. Anyway, I feel like, as always, we've probably run a little bit over time. If you have any further questions about Ninja, or you're really struggling, or I don't know, you want help with your Ninja deck, anything Katsu related, feel free to just look us an email, sessionblood@gmail.com, and we'll do our best to get back to you. And... yeah, I feel that pretty much wraps up things for the week.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for listening. Thanks
for listening, and tune in next time when we'll be potentially looking at game plans, how to identify and how to play them.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, thanks everyone.
Bye.